The James River moved slow and heavy that spring of 1609, carrying with it the smell of marsh and decay. Its brown waters lapped against the crude palisades of Jamestown, where weary men and women huddled behind sharpened logs, listening to the forest. The fort was no more than a ragged triangle of timber, its gates sagging, its walls scarred by weather and fear. Beyond those walls, the wilderness pressed in, dark forests that swallowed the light, home to peoples the settlers neither understood nor trusted. Edward Talbot leaned against the rough stockade, his ribs showing through the thin linen of his shirt. He had once been a proud man, leaving England with promises of gold and land whispered in his ear. Now his beard was matted, his belly hollow, his lips cracked from hunger. Around him, men argued in low voices, their words edged with desperation. They had come to this place to build a new world, but what they had built instead was a wooden prison surrounded by endless silence. The silence was broken by the cries of a child. A settler's son, pale and sickly, whimpered inside one of the wattle huts, his mother trying to hush him with a lullaby that carried no comfort. Disease stalked the fort as mercilessly as hunger. Fever left men shivering in their own sweat, and sores blackened their skin. Graves were dug shallow, barely covered before the earth claimed more. At night, Edward sometimes thought he saw shapes moving in the tree line, tall figures painted and silent. The Powhatan watched them, though few settlers had seen more than shadows or a fleeting glimpse of faces that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Some men cursed them as enemies, others spoke of peace. But in truth, none of the settlers understood what the natives thought of these pale, starving intruders on their land. Inside the fort, the air was filled with suspicion. Men accused one another of hoarding crumbs of corn. The leaders spoke of discipline, of loyalty to King James, but the men were too weak to listen. Rats were hunted, roots dug from the frozen ground, leather boiled until it softened enough to chew. They called it a colony, but it felt more like a graveyard waiting to be filled. Edward clutched the small wooden cross around his neck. He whispered a prayer, though even his faith had grown thin. He prayed not for riches or glory anymore, but simply for one more sunrise. For in Jamestown, the settlers had already begun to count life not in years, but in days. By November, the woods grew quiet. The birds had flown, the rivers slowed with ice at their edges, and the winds howled against the fort like hungry wolves. Food stores, meager to begin with, had long since dwindled. What little maize the Powhatan had traded earlier in the year was gone, eaten too fast, or stolen by desperate hands. The men tried hunting, but game slipped deeper into the forests where the pale strangers dared not follow. A few who did return came back with empty hands and hollow eyes, speaking of trails that vanished into swamps and the eerie stillness of trees that seemed to watch them. Edward Talbot felt the cold gnaw at him as much as the hunger. The huts of mud and timber leaked rain, and the smoke from their small fires filled the cramped air with choking bitterness. At night, the coughing of the sick echoed through the fort, broken by sobs or the rasp of last breaths. They had buried so many already that the ground at the edge of the fort bulged with shallow graves. One evening, a council was called. The captains stood by the flickering light of a torch, faces drawn tight, their fine coats now no better than rags. They spoke of order, of rationing, of God's will. But the men muttered, shifting in the shadows, and Edward knew what they thought. No plan could conjure food from empty barrels. Later that night, he wandered to the wall. He thought he heard voices from the forest, low, strange, like a chant carried by the wind. His heart thudded. He peered into the dark, where firelight flickered faintly between the trees. Were the Powhatan watching, waiting for them to weaken further? Or was it his starving mind weaving sounds from the groans of the wind? Behind him, a woman cried out. Her husband had just died, his body wasted to bone. They carried him to the earth, and the minister's thin voice offered prayers to the silence. Edward stared up at the black sky, shivering, whispering to himself, "How many of us will see the spring?" By midwinter, Jamestown was no longer a settlement but a hollow shell of human will. Snow lay heavy against the palisade walls, and the river froze in jagged patches. The settlers' stomachs shrank until they could no longer sleep for the ache. They chewed bark from trees, boiled shoe leather until it softened into strips, gnawed on dogs, cats, even rats when they could catch them. A man once dragged a crow into camp, its wings broken, and the starving gathered like wolves until it was torn apart before it even hit the pot. Edward Talbot felt his mind slipping some nights, wandering between waking and dream. He'd dream of bread thick, warm loaves like his mother once baked in England, only to wake with the taste of ashes on his tongue. He prayed harder, but even prayers felt dry, as if God himself had turned his face from them. One dawn, he found a man crouched near the burial ground, digging at the frozen earth with bloodied hands. The sight froze Edward in place. He did not speak, he dared not. The man's eyes were wild, lips torn and bleeding, and when he turned, Edward saw dirt caked around his mouth. No words were exchanged, only shame, only hunger. Rumors spread quickly, whispered at first, then openly spoken in shaking voices. Some had begun to eat the dead. When the captains discovered such acts, they thundered about sin, about damnation, about English honor. Yet they too were gaunt, their cheeks sunken, their hands trembling when they held a piece of boiled root. And outside the fort the Powhatan waited. No trade came now, no gifts of maize, only arrows loosed at any settler foolish enough to step beyond the walls. The forest itself seemed to turn against them, a living barrier of silence and threat. Edward kept a tally in the dirt of his hut wall. Each mark a life lost. By the start of the new year, the marks outnumbered the living. And still the hunger grew. By January, the walls of Jamestown felt like a coffin. Men who could still walk argued that the forest, though full of danger, was better than waiting to starve within the fort. Small groups began to slip through the gates, clutching muskets with hands too weak to steady them, venturing into the endless woods in search of anything that might fill a belly. Edward Talbot joined one such band. 6 men moved cautiously beneath the black skeletons of trees, snow crunching beneath their boots. Their breath hung in the air like ghosts. Every sound seemed louder in the stillness. The snap of a twig, the distant caw of a raven, the faint rush of unseen streams. They found no deer, no rabbits, not even tracks. The woods seemed emptied, as if the very creatures had fled this haunted land. Still, they pressed on, until one of the men spotted smoke curling above the treetops. A village, Powhatan. The men argued in whispers. Some said they should turn back, for to approach meant death. Others, their faces twisted by hunger, swore they would risk anything for a handful of maize. In the end, desperation made the choice. They crept closer, muskets ready. The village appeared through the trees, bark-covered lodges, a fire pit, figures moving. The Powhatan were there, strong, well-fed, armed with bows. For a moment, Edward felt both awe and terror. These people had mastered the land that was killing the English. They did not starve. They did not fear. But then an arrow hissed from the shadows. One of the men cried out, stumbling, blood soaking the snow. Another arrow followed, then a third. Panic seized them. The band scattered. Muskets fired blindly. Smoke and thunder cracking in the cold air. Edward ran until his legs gave way, tumbling into the icy mud. He crawled, gasping, heart pounding, hearing the chase behind him. The whispers of feet through snow, the haunting calls in a tongue he did not know. When he finally staggered back to the fort, only 2 of the 6 remained alive. The others were gone, swallowed by the forest. The gates shut behind them, and silence fell. Edward's hands still shook when he tried to speak. The men inside the fort asked what they had found. He had no answer but this: the forest is not ours. It belongs to death. The minister still held prayers each morning, though his voice had grown weak, his robes little more than rags. He read from a weathered Bible by the dim light of the hearth, his words rising into the smoke-filled air. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But even as he spoke, some men turned their faces away. Faith was a fragile flame in Jamestown. Hunger had smothered it, fear had blown against it, and many began to wonder if God had abandoned them on this wild shore. Edward Talbot felt it himself, the heaviness of doubt pressing into his chest. He would clasp the wooden cross around his neck and whisper a prayer, yet the silence afterward was unbearable. There were whispers now, not just of hunger but of curses. Men spoke of the Powhatan as spirits of the forest, of witches in the trees who chanted at night, calling death into the fort. Others said it was punishment for leaving England, for daring to set foot in a land not meant for them. One night, as a storm battered the palisade, Edward sat awake by the fire with a handful of others. A man named Hargreaves, once a soldier, now little more than bones in a ragged cloak, muttered that there was no salvation here, only the devil's work. His eyes glowed fever-bright in the firelight. "If God watches us," Hargreaves spat, "then he is crueler than any savage. I'll not kneel again." The minister struck him across the mouth for blasphemy, but the blow was weak, and Hargreaves only laughed, a sound bitter and hollow. Some men joined the laugh, though their faces were drawn with fear. Edward lay awake long after, staring at the rafters, listening to the wind groan against the walls. He thought of England, of green fields and warm bread, of his mother's gentle hand. Then he thought of the graves outside, the shallow earth that swallowed friend and foe alike. Faith, once a lifeline, now felt like ashes in his mouth. Still, when morning came, he joined the prayer. Not because he believed, but because it was all they had left. By February, hunger had made enemies of friends. Where once they had stood shoulder to raise the fort's walls, now men eyed each other with suspicion, their gazes sharp as blades. Every crumb of cornmeal, every scrap of salted meat, became a treasure worth killing for. Edward Talbot saw it first when a youth was caught gnawing at a bone he had not shared. The captains demanded to know where it had come from, but the boy only wept and swore he had found it near the refuse heap. Some believed him, others did not. Before long, fists flew, then knives. The boy did not survive the night. Worse still were the thefts. Muskets traded for a morsel, boots stolen from the feet of the sick, a pot of stew snatched in the dark and vanishing into the shadows of the huts. Every morning, men awoke counting their losses, not their blessings. The captains tried to keep order. They doled out punishments, flogging, stocks, even hanging. Yet each man they punished was another set of hands lost, another mouth that might have been silenced by hunger anyway. And the rest of the settlers grew harder, colder. Survival mattered more than law, more than loyalty, more than honor. Edward once caught a man rummaging in his hut while he slept. The thief's hand closed around a small bundle of dried roots Edward had gathered days before. They wrestled in silence, too weak for shouting, each desperate as drowning men. Edward struck him with a stone, again and again, until the man fell still. He stared down at what he had done, his chest heaving, his hands red. He buried the body beneath his own floor. No one asked where the man had gone. Afterward, Edward sat in the darkness, chewing one of the bitter roots, and thought, "I am no better than the wolves that circle us." The fort was no longer a colony. It was a pit, and the strongest clawed their way upward over the weak. The nights grew longer, colder, crueler. Jamestown lay half dead, a hollow carcass of timber and smoke. Yet the forest did not sleep. Sometimes, in the small hours, shapes moved beyond the palisade, tall, silent, watchful. Arrows struck the walls not to kill but to remind. The Powhatan were there. One morning, Edward Talbot woke to find an Englishman slumped against the gates. His chest pierced with a long shaft of flint-tipped wood. His eyes were still open, his lips blue with frost. No one knew when he had died, only that the enemy had come close enough to touch their walls. Whispers spread like fire. Some claimed the Powhatan were spirits who could not be killed, slipping through trees like smoke. Others said they were men, but stronger, cleverer, masters of a land the English would never tame. The captains ordered watches at all hours, though half the men posted were too weak to stand without leaning on their muskets. Edward took his turn at the palisade, staring into the black woods while snow drifted down. His eyes burned with weariness, but he dared not blink for long. He swore he saw faces painted in red, eyes glinting in the firelight, vanishing whenever he tried to fix his gaze. Once, in the distance, he heard laughter, sharp and cruel, carried on the wind. It made the hairs rise on his neck. That same week, a small party of settlers ventured out to gather firewood. Only 2 returned, dragging themselves through the gate, trembling and white with terror. They spoke of being surrounded, of arrows falling like rain, of warriors melting into the trees before a shot could find them. One man carried a gash across his scalp where a stone-headed war club had struck. No wood was gathered that day. The settlers burned furniture, tools, anything that would catch flame. The fort itself seemed to shrink, walls creaking as they stripped boards for kindling. Edward watched the firelight dance across their hollow faces and knew the truth. The Powhatan did not need to storm the fort. They had only to wait. Hunger was their greatest ally. Fear was the arrow already buried deep in every English heart. By March, Jamestown had become a ghost town peopled by shadows of men. Disease and hunger had claimed most. Those who remained were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their movements slow and deliberate, as if each step cost more than it should. The fort creaked with the weight of their suffering. Edward Talbot was among the last of the strong. He still moved with some purpose, still carried a weapon, still tended the sick when he could. But each day he felt the cold fingers of exhaustion wrap tighter around his chest. Every meal was a battle, every night a negotiation with the dark. Men spoke of leaving the fort, striking out into the forest for any scrap of food. Yet the forest had become a terror, a place where the living were preyed upon, where hunger and fear worked together. One settler tried it and never returned. Another staggered back, babbling about visions in the trees, about voices calling him into the snow. Inside the fort, quarrels flared more sharply than ever. Men accused one another of stealing, of hiding food, even of hoarding their very strength. Edward had to fight to keep control of his own sanity as well as his own share of provisions. Every act of kindness was a gamble. Helping one man could mean starvation for another. The nights were worst. Frost coated the ground, but the cold could not kill the creeping terror that rose from despair. Edward would hear footsteps in the dark, and though no one was there, the sound left his heart pounding. Sometimes he thought he saw figures in the shadows, fellow settlers, or the spirits of the dead, come to mock the living. And then there were the dreams. Dreams of bread he could taste but never eat, of fire that warmed him but would not burn, of England, always England, just out of reach. Edward woke each morning shivering, weak, and yet still alive. That alone felt like a miracle, though it was bitter to taste. The forest waited. The cold waited. Hunger waited. And Edward knew that the last of the strong were only a step away from joining the fallen. Spring arrived with a reluctant sun, weak and pale, offering no mercy. Jamestown did not bloom. It decayed. The few remaining settlers shuffled through the mud, their faces gaunt and drawn, their eyes hollow with hunger and fear. Each day brought more death, each night more whispers of madness. Edward Talbot walked among the huts, counting the living as though tallying coins. Every hut held a story of loss. A father gone, a wife dead, a child buried in the frozen earth. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting refuse. Rats scurried openly, unafraid, as if they knew the fort no longer belonged to men. Desperation now ruled the fort. Men traded scraps of clothing, shoes, even teeth, for a morsel of food. Arguments erupted over the smallest items. One man, delirious from hunger, struck another across the face and was killed in return. Edward buried him beneath the boards of his hut, muttering prayers he no longer believed. Outside, the Powhatan still watched. Their fires burned in the distance, unmoving, unhurried. No assault came. They knew the settlers were already undone. Arrows were unnecessary. The forest itself, the cold, and famine were allies that worked faster than any army. Edward wandered the palisade one night, staring into the black of the trees. He imagined shadows moving in the moonlight, the shapes of men who had died, returning to claim what remained. He felt the weight of the fort pressing down, its walls no longer protection but a cage. One morning, Edward discovered another body at the gate, a man who had tried to venture into the forest for food. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his fingers stiffened in a frozen claw. Edward closed them, whispered a broken prayer, and shivered. The descent was complete. Hope had been stripped away like bark from a tree. All that remained was survival, a grim, clawing persistence, measured not in days or weeks, but in breaths. By April, Jamestown was a place of whispers and shadows. Few souls remained, and those who did moved like phantoms through the mud and ruin of the fort. Every hut seemed haunted by the memories of the dead. The stench of corpses, shallow buried or unburied, clung to the air like smoke. Edward Talbot could not sleep. Each night, he saw faces in the flickering firelight. Men and women long gone, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in silent cries. He knew they were not real, but in the dark, with hunger gnawing at his stomach and the wind howling like 1,000 voices, reality was impossible to hold. The Powhatan remained beyond the walls, silent and patient. They no longer needed to attack. The living were already ghosts, their bodies weak, their spirits hollow. From the palisade, Edward watched them sometimes, wondering if they mocked the English, or if they pitied them. Inside the fort, the survivors whispered of the dead in frightened tones, as if speaking too loudly would draw them back. Men slept in shifts, one eye open, listening for the faintest sound. A footstep, a cough, a whisper in a language they could not understand. Even the minister, frail and trembling, seemed haunted, muttering prayers under his breath as he traced circles in the dirt. Edward wandered among the huts, clutching his cross, thinking of his mother, thinking of England, thinking of bread he would never taste again. He stumbled over a body at the gate, a young man who had succumbed during the night, his lips blue, his eyes open in eternal terror. Edward closed them gently, but the image stayed. The forest was no longer just outside. It was inside them, inside every shadow, inside every heartbeat. And Edward, walking among the ghosts of his companions and the living, understood that the boundary between life and death had thinned. Survival was no longer a matter of strength. It was a matter of imagination, of fear, of clinging to whatever scraps of humanity remained. By May, Jamestown teetered on the edge of annihilation. Only a handful of settlers remained, each one a hollow shell of the men and women who had first arrived, full of hope and ambition. Disease had claimed its victims, famine had stripped bodies to bones, and fear had hollowed out hearts. Edward Talbot moved among them, seeing death everywhere. Men lay in their huts, too weak to rise, eyes fixed on nothing. Women whispered prayers that had no sound, clutching children long dead. The minister, once a voice of solace, had become little more than a trembling figure, muttering verses that fell into empty air. Even the walls of the fort offered no comfort. The palisades sagged, the gates warped, and the river, once a lifeline, had grown brown and still, reflecting the sky like a sheet of lead. Outside, the forest pressed closer, dark and alive, a constant reminder that the settlers were intruders in a land they could not command. Hunger drove men to acts unthinkable. Edward had seen it. Men clawing through refuse, gnawing on bones, even risking death to steal scraps from their companions. Trust had vanished. Only suspicion remained. One morning, Edward counted the living and found only a dozen. 12 men and women left from 100. Their strength was fading, their hope even more so. They spoke in hushed tones of rescue, of ships returning, of England. Yet each day the river brought no salvation, only silence and the occasional driftwood that reminded them of the life beyond the fort. Edward stared across the river at the dark line of trees and whispered a prayer he barely believed. God, let us live, or take us swiftly. But God did not answer. The forest waited. Hunger waited. Death waited. And Jamestown, a fort of dreams turned nightmare, hung suspended on the knife's edge of despair. Relief came not with trumpets or proclamations, but with the slow, cautious creak of a ship's hull against the river. One morning, as the sun rose pale over Jamestown, Edward Talbot heard the faint sound of oars cutting through water. For a moment, he could not believe it. The world had been reduced to mud, hunger, and the endless dark of the forest. The settlers gathered at the palisade, hollow-eyed and trembling, unsure whether to hope or despair. The newcomers brought food, tools, and news from England, but also the weight of shock. So few had survived that they could be counted on one hand. Those who had lived through winter's hell stared at one another in silence, as if unsure whether they were still alive or ghosts returned to the living world. Edward walked among them, touching shoulders, whispering names, seeing the lost in every face. Men and women wept quietly, some from joy, some from grief, some from the simple fact that their bodies could finally rest from constant hunger. The forest behind them seemed quieter, yet more menacing than ever, a witness to the cruelty they had endured. The minister led a prayer of thanksgiving, his voice trembling but strong enough to reach the hearts of those who remained. Edward clutched his cross, feeling its weight both familiar and foreign. Faith had been tested to its limits, nearly broken, but it had survived, fragile yet real. As the day wore on, Edward looked out over the river, watching the ship's sails catch the sunlight. He thought of England, of warm hearths, of green fields he might never see again. But he also thought of the fort, of the lives that had ended there, of the hunger, the fear, and the forest that had tested them all. He understood, in a quiet, terrible way, that Jamestown had changed them. It had stripped away hope and innocence, left despair in its place, and yet, against all odds, it had not claimed them all. Survival was bitter, but it was theirs. And in that moment, Edward Talbot felt the first stirrings of something long denied. A cautious, trembling hope. The dawn was hard-won, and yet it was still a dawn.